Welcome to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. This is part 1 of 5 featuring the audiobook Pride and Prejudice. In this audiobook, the original Pride and Prejudice has been reimagined as if it had been originally written by best-selling New York Times and USA Today author Carole Browne. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by English author Jane Austen, originally published in 1813. It is a novel of manners that follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and has inspired many derivatives in modern literature. Carole Browne has written more than 100 novels and 8 novellas and contributed to multiple anthologies, selling more than 6 million copies. We hope you enjoy this classic book, Reimagined. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us what you like about this reimagined book, or what you think we need to do better next time. Thanks for watching and listening.
Chapter 1. A Singular Truth. In the serene village of Longbourn, nestled amidst the undulating hills of the English countryside, there existed a truth universally acknowledged. A single man blessed with ample fortune must surely be in pursuit of a wife. Though the sentiments and inclinations of such a man remained shrouded upon his initial foray into a new community, the notion was firmly entrenched in the collective consciousness of the local families. Indeed, he was deemed the rightful prize of one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," exclaimed his lady one fine morning, "have you received tidings that Netherfield Park has found a tenant at last?" To which Mr. Bennet responded with a simple negative. "But indeed it has," she persisted, "for Mrs. Long has just departed, and she divulged all the particulars to me." Mr. Bennet maintained his silence. "Do you not wish to ascertain the identity of the tenant?" his wife pressed, her impatience palpable. "You seem eager to relay the information to me, and I am quite receptive to hearing it." This served as sufficient enticement for Mr. Bennet to expound further. "Well, my dear, you should know that Mrs. Long avows Netherfield has been claimed by a young gentleman of substantial means hailing from the northern reaches of our country. He arrived in a chaise and 4 on Monday to inspect the estate, and so enamoured was he with the property that he promptly reached an agreement with Mr. Morris. He is slated to take possession before Michaelmas, with his retinue of servants to follow suit by the week's end." "And what is this gentleman's name?" "Bingley." "Is he wedded or unwed?" "Unwed, my dear, without a shadow of doubt. A bachelor of ample means, boasting an income of £4,000 or £5,000 per annum. What an auspicious development for our daughters." "In what manner does this concern them?" Mr. Bennet queried. "My dear Mr. Bennet," his wife chided, "how can you be so obtuse? Surely you perceive that I am contemplating a matrimonial alliance for one of our girls." "Is that his intention in taking up residence here?" Mr. Bennet inquired sceptically. "Intention? Preposterous! But it is highly probable that he may find himself smitten with one of our daughters. Hence, it behooves you to pay him a visit upon his arrival." "I see no necessity for such a course of action. You and the girls may go, or better yet, let them venture unaccompanied. Given your own charms, Mr. Bingley might find you the most appealing of the lot." "You flatter me, my dear. While I may have been considered comely in my youth, I make no such pretensions now. When a woman has borne 5 grown daughters, she must relinquish thoughts of her former beauty. In such circumstances, a woman seldom has much beauty left to contemplate. Nevertheless, my dear, it is imperative that you pay Mr. Bingley a visit upon his arrival." "I make no such commitment," Mr. Bennet asserted. "But think of our daughters. Consider the prospects such an establishment would afford one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are resolute in their intent to pay their respects, solely for that reason. It is incumbent upon us to do the same, for we shall be precluded from doing so if you abstain." "You are excessively scrupulous, my dear. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be quite pleased to receive your visit. I shall dispatch a note with you, expressing my hearty consent to his choosing whichever of our daughters he deems fit for marriage, though I shall certainly advocate for my dear Lizzie." I implore you to refrain from such actions. Lizzie is no more deserving than her sisters, and I am certain she is neither as beautiful as Jane nor as amiable as Lydia. Yet you persist in favouring her. They all lack any remarkable qualities, Mr. Bennet conceded. They are all as foolish and ignorant as any other young girls. However, Lizzie possesses a certain wit that sets her apart from her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you disparage your own children in such a manner? You seem to take pleasure in vexing me. You show no consideration for my poor nerves. You misunderstand me, my dear. I hold your nerves in high regard. They are old acquaintances of mine, having been the subject of your discourse for at least 20 years. Ah, you cannot fathom my suffering, but I trust you will endure it, and perhaps even live to witness the arrival of many more young men of considerable fortune in our neighbourhood. It would be of no consequence to us if 20 such men were to come, as you refuse to pay them any heed. Rest assured, my dear, that when there are 20, I shall pay them all a visit. Mr. Bennet remained an enigmatic blend of quick wit, sardonic humour, reticence, and caprice, a conundrum that his wife, despite 23 years of marriage, had yet to unravel. Her own disposition, by contrast, was far more transparent. She was a woman of modest intellect, possessing scant knowledge and a mercurial temperament. In times of discontent, she fancied herself afflicted with nerves. The pursuit of advantageous marriages for her daughters consumed her existence, while solace was sought in social calls and the latest gossip. Chapter 2. A Fortuitous Encounter. Mr. Bennet, ever the discerning gentleman, found himself among the earliest callers upon Mr. Bingley. His intentions to pay the visit had long been harboured, though he had persistently assured his wife to the contrary. Until the eve following this auspicious visit, she remained unaware of his actions, the revelation unfolding in an unexpected manner. As Mr. Bennet observed his second daughter, Elizabeth, engaged in the art of hat trimming, he seized upon the moment to address her thus. "I hope Mr. Bingley will approve, Lizzie." "We are hardly in a position to discern Mr. Bingley's preferences," her mother interjected, her tone laden with resentment, "given that we are not to call upon him." "But you overlook, mamma," Elizabeth interjected, "that we shall encounter him at the upcoming assemblies, where Mrs. Long has pledged to effect an introduction." "I have no faith in Mrs. Long fulfilling such a promise. She has her own nieces to consider. She is a self-serving, deceitful woman, and I hold no esteem for her." "Nor do I," Mr. Bennet concurred, "and I am heartened to find that you do not rely on her assistance." Mrs. Bennet, choosing not to dignify this remark with a response, instead redirected her attention to one of her daughters, admonishing, "Kitty, please cease your incessant coughing. Show some consideration for my nerves. You fray them to ribbons." "Kitty lacks discretion in her coughs," her father observed dryly. "She chooses her moments poorly." "I do not cough for my own amusement," Kitty retorted, her frustration palpable. "When is the next ball to be held, Lizzie?" Mrs. Bennet redirected the conversation. "In a fortnight's time," Elizabeth replied. "Aye, indeed," her mother exclaimed, "and Mrs. Long will not return until the day prior. Thus it will be impossible for her to introduce him, as she will be unacquainted with him herself." "In that case, my dear, you shall have the opportunity to introduce Mr. Bingley to your friend," Mr. Bennet suggested. "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, utterly impossible, considering I am unacquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing?" "I commend your prudence. A fortnight's acquaintance is but a trifle. One cannot discern a man's true character in such a short span. But if we do not take the initiative, someone else surely will. Mrs. Long and her nieces must take their chances. Therefore, as she will view it as an act of kindness if you decline, I shall assume the responsibility myself." The girls stared at their father, while Mrs. Bennet uttered only, "Nonsense, nonsense." "What is the import of that emphatic interjection?" Mr. Bennet inquired. "Do you deem the customary forms of introduction and their significance to be nonsensical? I cannot entirely concur with you on that point. What say you, Mary?" You are a young lady of contemplation, renowned for your extensive reading and literary extracts. Mary, desiring to contribute sagely, but finding herself at a loss for words, remained silent. While Mary gathers her thoughts, Mr. Bennet resumed, let us return our attention to Mr. Bingley. I am utterly weary of Mr. Bingley, his wife declared. I regret to hear that sentiment. Why did you not express it sooner? Had I known this morning, I surely would not have called upon him. It is most unfortunate. However, as the visit has been paid, we cannot avoid the acquaintance now. The astonishment of the ladies mirrored his intentions precisely, with Mrs. Bennet's perhaps eclipsing the others. Yet, once the initial joyous tumult subsided, she began to assert that such an outcome had been expected all along. How admirable of you, my dear Mr. Bennet, but I was confident I would persuade you eventually. I knew your love for our girls would not permit you to overlook such an acquaintance. How pleased I am, and what a delightful jest it is that you should have ventured out this morning, yet kept silent until now. Now, Kitty, feel free to cough to your heart's content, Mr. Bennet remarked, before exiting the room, weary from his wife's exuberance. What an exemplary father you have, girls, Mrs. Bennet remarked once the door closed. I cannot fathom how you shall ever repay him for his kindness, nor myself for that matter. At our stage of life, forging new acquaintances each day is hardly pleasant, I assure you. Yet, for your sakes, we are willing to endure anything. Lydia, my dear, though you are the youngest, I have no doubt Mr. Bingley shall favour you with a dance at the next ball. Oh, Lydia declared boldly, I harbour no fear, for though I am the youngest, I am also the tallest. The remainder of the evening was spent conjecturing the timing of Mr. Bennet's return visit, and deliberating when they should extend an invitation to him for dinner. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Ballroom. In the serene village of Longbourn, where whispers dance on the breeze and secrets linger in the shadows, Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters embarked on a quest to unravel the enigma that was Mr. Bingley. They besieged him with brazen inquiries, artful conjectures, and speculative musings, yet he remained elusive, evading their every attempt. Left to glean what they could, they turned to the neighbourly wisdom of Lady Lucas, whose report painted a portrait of Mr. Bingley that was nothing short of glowing. Sir William, it seemed, had been thoroughly charmed by him. He was young, strikingly handsome, exceedingly amiable, and to crown it all, he planned to grace the next assembly with his presence and a sizable entourage. Oh, the joy that filled their hearts! To have a fondness for dancing was surely a precursor to falling in love, and the anticipation of Mr. Bingley's affections set their hopes alight. If I can see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet confided in her husband, and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing left to wish for. In due course, Mr. Bingley reciprocated Mr. Bennet's visit, though his stay in the library extended but a brief 10 minutes. He had harboured hopes of glimpsing the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, yet found himself in the sole company of their father. The ladies, however, fared somewhat better, spying from an upper window to ascertain that he sported a blue coat and rode a sleek black horse. An invitation to dine was promptly dispatched, and Mrs. Bennet began to meticulously plan the feast that would reflect favourably upon her domestic prowess. Alas, their anticipation was short-lived, as an answer arrived deferring the engagement. Mr. Bingley found himself obligated to journey to town the following day, thus rendering him unable to accept their hospitality. Mrs. Bennet was thrown into disarray. What business could he possibly have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire? Fears of his perpetual wanderings, forever eluding the settled life at Netherfield, plagued her thoughts, yet Lady Lucas offered a glimmer of hope, suggesting that his trip to London might be to secure a grand party for the upcoming ball. Rumours soon circulated that Mr. Bingley would arrive with a retinue of 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen in tow. The girls lamented the prospect of such a crowded affair, only to find solace in the revelation that Mr. Bingley had brought only 6 companions from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. As the party entered the assembly room, they were greeted by Mr. Bingley's congenial countenance and gentlemanly demeanour. His sisters exuded an air of fashion, while his brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, possessed a mere semblance of gentlemanliness. But it was Mr. Darcy, his tall frame and noble mien commanding attention, who soon became the subject of admiration. Whispers of his vast fortune spread like wildfire, and the room found itself captivated by his presence, until his aloof demeanour and disdainful countenance dampened the fervour, leaving him deemed unworthy of comparison to his amiable friend. Mr. Bingley, on the other hand, effortlessly ingratiated himself with the assembly, his lively spirit and unreserved charm earning him widespread acclaim. What a contrast he presented to Mr. Darcy! While Mr. Bingley danced with every lady in attendance and expressed his disappointment at the ball's premature end, Mr. Darcy remained aloof, sparing his attentions only for his own party. The evening, though marred by Mr. Darcy's disdain, passed pleasantly for the Bennet family. Jane, much admired by the Netherfield party, danced twice with Mr. Bingley, while Elizabeth, despite her father's vexation at Mr. Darcy's conduct, recounted the evening's events with spirited delight. Mrs. Bennet, effusive in her praise of Mr. Bingley's charms, found herself enamoured by his sister's elegance and refinement. As they returned home to Longbourn, the village they called their own, their hearts were filled with the promise of romance and the allure of love's dance. Chapter 4. Sisterly Reflections. In the quiet confines of their chamber, Jane and Elizabeth found a moment to exchange their thoughts. Jane, who had exercised caution in her previous assessment of Mr. Bingley, now poured forth her admiration for him to her sister. "He embodies all that a young man should be," Jane declared softly, her voice filled with warmth. "Sensible, good-humoured, lively. His manners, Lizzie, they are simply delightful, so much ease, yet with such perfect good breeding." Elizabeth, in her characteristic wit, replied, "Indeed, he is handsome, which is another trait a young man ought to possess if he can. With his character and looks, he stands as the epitome of what is desirable." "I was truly flattered when he asked me to dance a second time," Jane admitted, her cheeks tinged with a blush. "I had not anticipated such a compliment." "Ah, but I had anticipated it for you," Elizabeth countered with a playful smile. "You see, compliments have a way of taking you by surprise, whereas I am rarely caught off guard. But can you blame him for wanting to dance with you again? It was quite evident that you outshone every other woman in the room. His gallantry, though commendable, was hardly necessary in this case." "He is indeed agreeable," Jane continued, "and I give you full permission to like him. You have shown affections for far less deserving individuals in the past, dear Lizzie." Elizabeth chuckled, affectionately teasing her sister. "Oh, Jane, you are far too generous in your judgments. You have always possessed a penchant for finding the good in people. I cannot recall a single instance where you spoke ill of anyone." "I strive not to judge hastily," Jane replied earnestly, "but to speak only what I truly think." "And therein lies the marvel," Elizabeth remarked with admiration. "With your wisdom, you remain genuinely blind to the flaws of others. Many affect candour, but your sincerity sets you apart. You have a rare gift of seeing the best in everyone, of enhancing their virtues and overlooking their faults." "And what of Mr. Bingley's sisters?" Jane inquired, shifting the conversation. "Do you find them agreeable as well?" "At first, their manners did not match his," Elizabeth confessed, "but upon closer acquaintance, they proved to be charming women. Miss Bingley, especially, will make a fine neighbour as she oversees her brother's household." Listening intently, Elizabeth absorbed her sister's words, though she remained unconvinced. The sisters differed in their observations. Where Jane saw kindness, Elizabeth perceived conceit. Despite their outward charm, the Bingley sisters lacked humility, their pride evident in their every gesture. With a fortune of £20,000 and the airs of privileged upbringing, they deemed themselves superior to those around them. Their family's respectable lineage mattered more to them than the fact that their wealth came from trade. As for Mr. Bingley, his affable nature and amiable disposition endeared him to many, especially to his steadfast friend Mr. Darcy. Though their characters clashed, their friendship endured, strengthened by mutual respect and understanding. Mr. Bingley, with his inherited wealth and easy temperament, contemplated the future. Would he settle at Netherfield permanently, or would he pursue greater ambitions? The answer remained uncertain, much like his friendship with Mr. Darcy. As they reflected on the events of the Meryton Assembly, Jane and Elizabeth found themselves at odds with their assessments of the Bingley sisters and Mr. Darcy. Yet amidst their differences, their sisterly bond remained unshakable, a source of comfort and strength in the face of life's uncertainties. Chapter 5. Conversations at Longbourn. Close to the quaint village of Longbourn resided a family with whom the Bennets shared a close bond. Sir William Lucas, once engaged in trade in the bustling town of Meryton, had amassed a respectable fortune and earned the title of knighthood through a commendable address to the king during his mayoral term. However, the weight of his newfound distinction had soured his taste for business and small-town life, prompting him to relocate his family to Lucas Lodge, where he could relish his status and devote himself entirely to amiability. Despite his elevated rank, Sir William remained affable and approachable, extending kindness to all. Lady Lucas, his wife, possessed a gentle disposition that made her a cherished neighbour to Mrs. Bennet. Together, they had several children, including their eldest daughter Charlotte, who, at 27, shared a close friendship with Elizabeth Bennet. It was deemed essential for the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets to convene to discuss the events of the recent ball, and thus, the morning after the assembly, the former paid a visit to Longbourn. "You made quite the impression last night, Charlotte," Mrs. Bennet remarked graciously. "You were Mr. Bingley's initial choice." Charlotte, ever composed, replied, "Indeed, but he seemed to prefer his second choice." "Ah, you refer to Jane, I presume, since he danced with her twice," Mrs. Bennet mused. "It certainly appeared as though he admired her. I overheard something about Mr. Robinson." "Perhaps you mean the conversation between him and Mr. Robinson," Charlotte suggested. "I mentioned it to you. Mr. Robinson inquired about his opinion of the Meryton assemblies and the prettiest ladies present, to which he promptly declared, 'The eldest Miss Bennet, beyond a doubt.'" Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, "How decisive! It does seem promising, but it may come to naught after all." "My observations were more telling than yours, Eliza," Charlotte remarked. "Mr. Darcy is not as captivating as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza, to be deemed barely tolerable." "I implore you not to let Mr. Darcy's behaviour trouble you," Mrs. Bennet interjected. "He is such a disagreeable man that it would be a misfortune to earn his favour. Mrs. Long confided in me last night that he sat in silence next to her for half an hour." Jane, ever the optimist, interjected, "Are you certain, ma'am? I saw Mr. Darcy conversing with her." "Yes, because she finally addressed him about Netherfield," Mrs. Bennet explained, but she remarked that he seemed perturbed by her inquiry. "Miss Bingley informed me," Jane added, "that he only speaks freely among his intimate acquaintances. With them, he is quite agreeable." "I cannot believe a word of it, my dear," Mrs. Bennet countered. "If he were truly agreeable, he would have conversed with Mrs. Long, but I suspect he learned she arrived at the ball in a hack chaise, and his pride forbade him from engaging with her." Charlotte chimed in, "While his pride does not offend me as much as others, it is somewhat justified. One cannot fault such a fine young man, with wealth and pedigree, for holding himself in high regard. He has every right to be proud." Elizabeth, however, interjected, "While that may be true, his pride becomes harder to forgive when it humiliates others." Mary, ever eager to share her philosophical musings, added, "Pride is indeed a common failing, as I've learned from my readings. Human nature inclines us towards self-complacency, and few are exempt from it. Vanity and pride, though often conflated, are distinct. Pride concerns our self-opinion, while vanity pertains to others' perception of us." A young Lucas, brimming with youthful exuberance, interjected, "If I were as wealthy as Mr. Darcy, I wouldn't mind being proud. I would indulge in fox hunting and wine." Mrs. Bennet, ever the pragmatist, replied, "You would indulge far too much, my dear, and if I caught you, I would confiscate your bottle immediately." With this playful exchange, the conversation concluded, leaving the Bennet household abuzz with the day's lively discussions. Chapter 6. A Dance and Deliberations. The ladies of Longbourn soon paid a visit to Netherfield, and their visit was duly returned. Miss Bennet's amiable manners endeared her to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, although Mrs. Bennet was deemed intolerable, and the younger Bennet sisters were not considered worth engaging with. Nevertheless, a desire to become better acquainted with the two eldest Bennet sisters was expressed. Jane received this attention with the utmost pleasure, but Elizabeth, ever observant, perceived a superciliousness in their demeanour towards everyone, including her sister. She could not bring herself to like them, although she acknowledged their kindness towards Jane, however slight, likely stemmed from their brother's admiration. It was evident to all whenever they met that Mr. Bingley admired Jane, and to Jane it was equally clear that she was developing a strong affection for him. Elizabeth, however, took comfort in the fact that Jane's reserved nature and composed demeanour would shield her from the prying eyes of the impertinent. She shared her observations with her friend, Miss Lucas. Charlotte responded, "It may be pleasant to deceive the public in such matters, but being overly guarded can sometimes be a disadvantage. If a woman conceals her affection from the object of it, she may miss the chance to secure him. It would be poor consolation to believe that the world is equally unaware. Almost every attachment is tinged with gratitude or vanity, making it unwise to leave things to chance. A slight preference is natural, but few have enough heart to be truly in love without encouragement. In most cases, a woman is better off showing more affection than she feels. Bingley undoubtedly likes your sister, but he may never progress beyond that liking if she does not encourage him." "But she does encourage him, as much as her nature allows," Elizabeth countered. "If I can discern her regard for him, he must be a simpleton indeed not to notice." "Remember, Eliza, he does not know Jane as you do," Charlotte cautioned. "But if a woman favours a man, and makes no effort to conceal it, he must notice," Elizabeth insisted. "Perhaps he must, if he spends enough time with her. But although Bingley and Jane meet frequently, it is never for extended periods. They always encounter each other in large gatherings, where they cannot possibly converse exclusively. Jane should therefore make the most of every opportunity she has to capture his attention. Once she has secured it, there will be plenty of time for her to fall in love as deeply as she wishes." "Your strategy is sound, in matters where the sole aim is a good marriage," Elizabeth replied. "If I were determined to secure a wealthy husband, or any husband, I would surely adopt it. But these are not Jane's sentiments. She's not acting out of calculation. At this point, she cannot even be sure of the extent of her own feelings or their reasonableness. She has only known him for a fortnight. She danced 4 times with him at Meryton, saw him once at his house, and has dined in his company 4 times. This is hardly enough time for her to grasp his character." "Not as you portray it," Charlotte agreed. "Had she only dined with him, she might have only discovered his appetite. But you must remember that they have also spent 4 evenings together, and 4 evenings can reveal a great deal." "Yes, these 4 evenings have shown them that they both prefer Vingtione to commerce, but regarding any other significant character traits, I doubt much has been revealed." "Well," said Charlotte, "I wish Jane success with all my heart. If she were married to him tomorrow, I would consider her as likely to be as happy as if she had spent a year studying his character. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. Even if the parties' dispositions are well known or similar beforehand, it does not enhance their felicity in the least. They inevitably grow sufficiently dissimilar afterward to experience their share of vexation. It is better to know as little as possible about the defects of the person with whom you will spend your life." "You amuse me, Charlotte," Elizabeth remarked, "but your reasoning is unsound. You know it is, and you would never act in such a manner yourself." While Elizabeth was preoccupied with observing Mr. Bingley's attentions towards her sister, she was unaware that she was becoming an object of interest to his friend, Mr. Darcy. Initially, Mr. Darcy had barely considered her pretty and had looked at her without admiration at the ball. However, once he convinced himself and his friends that she had hardly a good feature in her face, he began to find her remarkably intelligent due to the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. This discovery was followed by others equally mortifying. Although he had initially noticed more than one imperfection in her figure, he was forced to acknowledge her figure as light and pleasing. Despite his assertion that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he found himself captivated by their easy playfulness. Elizabeth remained oblivious to all this. To her, Mr. Darcy was simply a man who was agreeable nowhere, and who had not deemed her attractive enough to dance with. He began to wish to learn more about her, and as a first step towards conversing with her, he paid attention to her interactions with others. His attention did not go unnoticed. One evening, at Sir William Lucas's residence, where a large gathering had assembled, Elizabeth remarked to Charlotte, "What does Mr. Darcy mean by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster?" "That is a question only Mr. Darcy can answer," Charlotte replied. "But if he continues to do so, I shall certainly let him know that I am aware of his actions. He has a very satirical eye, and if I do not counter his impertinence, I shall soon grow apprehensive of him." Charlotte challenged her. On his approaching them soon afterward, though without seeming to have any intention of speaking, Miss Lucas defied her friend to mention such a subject to him, which immediately provoking Elizabeth to do it, she turned to him and said, "Did not you think, Mr. Darcy, that I expressed myself uncommonly well just now, when I was teasing Colonel Forster to give us a ball at Meryton?" "With great energy, but it is a subject which always makes a lady energetic," Mr. Darcy replied. "You are severe on us." "It will be her turn soon to be teased," Miss Lucas chimed in. "I am going to open the instrument, Eliza, and you know what follows." "You are a very strange creature by way of a friend, always wanting me to play and sing before anybody and everybody. If my vanity had taken a musical turn, you would have been invaluable. But as it is, I would really rather not sit down before those who must be accustomed to hearing the very best performers." Despite her protestations, Elizabeth eventually acquiesced, saying, "Very well, if it must be so, it must." And with a serious look at Mr. Darcy, she added, "There is a very fine old saying, which everybody here is of course familiar with, 'Keep your breath to cool your porridge,' and I shall keep mine to swell my song." Her performance, though not extraordinary, was pleasing. After a song or two, and before she could respond to the pleas of several guests for another song, she was replaced at the instrument by her sister Mary. Mary, eager to display her knowledge and accomplishments, launched into a concerto, though she lacked both genius and taste. Despite her vanity-driven diligence, she could not match Elizabeth's easy and unaffected manner, and her performance, though technically proficient, lacked the charm of Elizabeth's. At the end of a long concerto, Mary was relieved to garner praise and gratitude by performing Scotch and Irish airs at the request of her younger sisters, who, along with some of the Lucases and a few officers, eagerly commenced dancing at one end of the room. Mr. Darcy, standing nearby, observed with silent indignation at what he considered a frivolous mode of passing the evening, to the exclusion of meaningful conversation. He was too absorbed in his own thoughts to realize that Sir William Lucas was nearby until Sir William addressed him. "What a delightful pastime for young people this is, Mr. Darcy. There is nothing quite like dancing, after all. I consider it one of the first refinements of civilized society." "Certainly, sir, and it is also popular among less refined societies of the world. Every savage can dance," Mr. Darcy replied, his tone neutral. Sir William merely smiled. "Your friend dances wonderfully," he continued, upon seeing Bingley join the group. "And I have no doubt that you are skilled in the art yourself, Mr. Darcy." "You saw me dance at Meryton, I believe, sir," Mr. Darcy replied. "Yes, indeed, and I derived no small pleasure from the sight. Do you often dance at St. James A.S.? Sir William inquired. Never, sir. Do you not think it would be a fitting tribute to the venue? It is a tribute I never pay to any venue if I can avoid it. You have a townhouse, I presume? Sir William pressed. Mr. Darcy inclined his head. I once considered settling in town myself, as I am fond of refined society, but I was uncertain whether the London air would agree with Lady Lucas. He paused, hoping for a response, but Sir William did not press the matter further. Just as Elizabeth approached them, Sir William seized upon the opportunity to perform a gallant act and exclaimed, My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, permit me to introduce this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance when such beauty is before you. Taking Elizabeth's hand, he offered it to Mr. Darcy, who, though surprised, was not averse to accepting it. However, Elizabeth promptly withdrew her hand and said with some discomposure to Sir William, Indeed, sir, I have no intention of dancing. I implore you not to assume that I moved in this direction to seek a partner. Mr. Darcy, with proper decorum, requested the honour of her hand, but Elizabeth remained resolute, unaffected by Sir William's attempts at persuasion. You excel in the dance so much, Miss Eliza, that it is cruel to deny me the pleasure of seeing you. And although this gentleman may not appreciate the pastime in general, I am sure he will not object to joining us for half an hour, Sir William pleaded. Mr. Darcy is nothing if not polite, Elizabeth remarked, smiling. Indeed, but given the inducement, my dear Miss Eliza, we cannot blame him for his compliance. Who could object to such a partner? Sir William replied. Elizabeth looked mischievous and turned away. Her refusal had not diminished her appeal in Mr. Darcy's eyes, and he found himself thinking of her with some satisfaction when Miss Bingley approached him. I can guess what you're pondering, Miss Bingley declared. I doubt that, Mr. Darcy replied. You are contemplating how insufferable it would be to spend many evenings in this manner, in such company. And indeed, I fully agree with you. I have never been more annoyed. The dullness, yet the noise, the vacuity, yet the self-importance of all these people. How I wish to hear your criticisms of them. Your speculation is entirely incorrect, I assure you. My thoughts were engaged in a more agreeable manner. I have been reflecting on the great pleasure that a pair of fine eyes in the face of a beautiful woman can bestow, Mr. Darcy confessed. Miss Bingley immediately fixed her gaze on his face and asked him to reveal which lady had inspired such reflections. With great boldness, Mr. Darcy replied, Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, Miss Bingley repeated incredulously. I am utterly astonished. How long has she been such a favourite? And when may I offer my congratulations? That is precisely the question I expected you to ask. A lady's imagination is remarkably swift. It leaps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in an instant. I knew you would be wishing me joy. If you are so serious about it, I shall consider the matter as absolutely settled. You will have a charming mother-in-law indeed, and she will undoubtedly be a frequent visitor to Pemberley. Mr. Darcy listened to her with perfect indifference, as her fanciful musings entertained her. His composure reassured her that all was well, and she continued to jest. Chapter 7. A Mother's Designs. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of £2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed, in default of heirs male, on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. Her father had been an attorney in Meryton, and had left her £4,000. She had a sister married to a Mr. Phillips, who had been a clerk to their father and succeeded him in the business, and a brother settled in London in a respectable line of trade. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, a most convenient distance for the young ladies, who were usually tempted thither 3 or 4 times a week to pay their duty to their aunt, and to a milliner's shop just over the way. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent in these attentions. Their minds were more vacant than their sisters', and when nothing better offered, a walk to Meryton was necessary to amuse their morning hours and furnish conversation for the evening, and however bare of news the country in general might be, they always contrived to learn some from their aunt. At present, indeed, they were well supplied both with news and happiness by the recent arrival of a militia regiment in the neighbourhood. It was to remain the whole winter, and Meryton was the headquarters. Their visits to Mrs. Phillips were now productive of the most interesting intelligence. Every day added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. Their lodgings were not long a secret, and at length they began to know the officers themselves. Mr. Phillips visited them all, and this opened to his nieces a source of felicity unknown before. They could talk of nothing but officers, and Mr. Bingley's large fortune, the mention of which gave animation to their mother, was worthless in their eyes when opposed to the regimentals of an ensign. After listening one morning to their effusions on this subject, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I can collect by your manner of talking, you must be two of the silliest girls in the country. I have suspected it some time, but I'm now convinced." Catherine was disconcerted and made no answer, but Lydia, with perfect indifference, continued to express her admiration of Captain Carter and her hope of seeing him in the course of the day, as he was going the next morning to London. "I am astonished, my dear," said Mrs. Bennet, "that you should be so ready to think your own children silly. If I wish to think slightingly of anybody's children, it should not be of my own, however. If my children are silly, I must hope to be always sensible of it. Yes, but as it happens, they are all of them very clever. This is the only point, I flatter myself, on which we do not agree. I had hoped that our sentiments coincided in every particular, but I must so far differ from you as to think our two youngest daughters uncommonly foolish. My dear Mr. Bennet, you must not expect such girls to have the sense of their father and mother. When they get to our age, I dare say, they will not think about officers any more than we do. I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself very well, and indeed so I do still at my heart. And if a smart young colonel, with 5,000 or 6,000 a year, should want one of my girls, I shall not say nay to him, and I thought Colonel Forster looked very becoming the other night at Sir William's in his regimentals." "Mamma," cried Lydia, "my aunt says that Colonel Forster and Captain Carter do not go so often to Miss Watson's as they did when they first came. She sees them now very often standing in Clark's library." Mrs. Bennet was prevented replying by the entrance of the footman with a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure, and she was eagerly calling out, while her daughter read, "Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "With the officers!" cried Lydia. "I wonder my aunt did not tell us of that." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear. You had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "That would be a good scheme," said Elizabeth, "if you were sure that they would not offer to send her home." "Oh, but the gentlemen will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs. I had much rather go in the coach." "But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are not they?" "They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them." "But if you have got them today," said Elizabeth, "my mother's purpose will be answered." She did at last extort from her father an acknowledgment that the horses were engaged. Jane was therefore obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Her hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were uneasy for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. "This was a lucky idea of mine indeed," said Mrs. Bennet more than once, as if the credit of making it rain were all her own. Till the next morning, however, she was not aware of all the felicity of her contrivance. Breakfast was scarcely over when a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which, I suppose, is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me, and, excepting a sore throat and a headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc." "Well, my dear," said Mr. Bennet, when Elizabeth had read the note aloud, "if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders." "Oh, I'm not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage." Elizabeth, feeling really anxious, determined to go to her, though the carriage was not to be had, and as she was no horsewoman, walking was her only alternative. She declared her resolution. "How can you be so silly," cried her mother, "as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there." "I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want." "Is this a hint to me, Lizzie," said her father, "to send for the horses?" "No, indeed. I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive, only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner." "I admire the activity of your benevolence," observed Mary, "but every impulse of feeling should be guided by reason, and, in my opinion, exertion should always be in proportion to what is required." "We will go as far as Meryton with you," said Catherine and Lydia. Elizabeth accepted their company, and the 3 young ladies set off together. "If we make haste," said Lydia as they walked along, "perhaps we may see something of Captain Carter before he goes." In Meryton they parted. The 2 youngest repaired to the lodgings of one of the officers' wives, and Elizabeth continued her walk alone, crossing field after field at a quick pace, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles with impatient activity, and finding herself at last within view of the house, with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She was shown into the breakfast parlour, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a great deal of surprise. That she should have walked 3 miles so early in the day in such dirty weather, and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and Elizabeth was convinced that they held her in contempt for it. She was received, however, very politely by them, and in their brother's manners there was something better than politeness. There was good humour and kindness. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all. The former was divided between admiration of the brilliancy which exercise had given to her complexion and doubt as to the occasions justifying her coming so far alone. The latter was thinking only of his breakfast. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favourably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up, was very feverish, and not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth was glad to be taken to her immediately, and Jane, who had only been withheld by the fear of giving alarm or inconvenience from expressing in her note how much she longed for such a visit, was delighted at her entrance. She was not equal, however, to much conversation, and when Miss Bingley left them together, could attempt little beside expressions of gratitude for the extraordinary kindness she was treated with. Elizabeth silently attended her. When breakfast was over, they were joined by the sisters, and Elizabeth began to like them herself, when she saw how much affection and solicitude they showed for Jane. The apothecary came, and having examined his patient, said, as might be supposed, that she had caught a violent cold, and that they must endeavour to get the better of it, advised her to return to bed, and promised her some draughts. The advice was followed readily, for the feverish symptoms increased and her head ached acutely. Elizabeth did not quit her room for a moment, nor were the other ladies often absent. The gentlemen being out, they had in fact nothing to do elsewhere. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. Miss Bingley offered her the carriage, and she only wanted a little pressing to accept it, when Jane testified such concern at parting with her that Miss Bingley was obliged to convert the offer of the chaise into an invitation to remain at Netherfield for the present. Elizabeth most thankfully consented, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with her stay and bring back a supply of clothes. Chapter 8. Dinner Drama. At 5 o'clock, the two ladies headed upstairs to change, and by 6:30, Elizabeth found herself summoned to dinner. As soon as she walked in, a flood of polite questions came her way. Among them, Mr. Bingley's genuine concern stood out. Sadly, she couldn't give him good news. Jane was no better. The Bingley sisters feigned shock, repeating how dreadful it was to have a cold and how much they hated being sick themselves, but their sympathy didn't last long. Their indifference only fueled Elizabeth's original dislike for them. Mr. Bingley was the sole bright spot in the room, his worry for Jane evident, and his attentions to Elizabeth comforting. It made her feel less like an intruder, despite the cold reception from the others. Miss Bingley was engrossed in Mr. Darcy, and her sister wasn't much different. Mr. Hurst, seated next to Elizabeth, was only interested in eating, drinking, and playing cards. When he discovered she preferred a simple dish to the fancy ragout, he had nothing to say to her. Dinner wrapped up, and Elizabeth hurried back to Jane. As soon as she left, Miss Bingley began tearing her apart, calling her manners a mix of pride and impertinence. Mrs. Hurst agreed, adding that Elizabeth had nothing to recommend her but her walking ability, recalling her wild appearance that morning with disdain. "She looked almost wild, Louisa," Mrs. Hurst said. "I could hardly keep a straight face." "Indeed, her hair was a mess, and her petticoat, did you see it? 6 inches deep in mud," Miss Bingley chimed in. Mr. Bingley defended Elizabeth, saying he hadn't noticed the dirt and thought she looked fine. Miss Bingley, trying to appeal to Mr. Darcy, suggested he wouldn't want his sister making such an exhibition, but Darcy found Elizabeth's care for her sister pleasing. Later, the conversation shifted to Jane's family and their connections, with the Bingley sisters mocking them. Bingley found their jest distasteful but said nothing. After their snide remarks, they went back to Jane's room, pretending to care. Elizabeth, once Jane was asleep, decided to join the others downstairs. Finding them playing cards, she declined to join, preferring to read. Mr. Hurst was shocked at her preference for reading over cards, and Miss Bingley derisively commented on Elizabeth's supposed disdain for cards and love for reading. Elizabeth assured them she enjoyed many things, not just reading. Bingley kindly offered her more books from his library, which she politely declined, satisfied with what was at hand. The conversation then turned to the grandeur of Pemberley's library, Miss Bingley gushing over it and Mr. Darcy's contributions. Elizabeth was so intrigued by their discussion that she laid her book aside and moved to the card table to observe. Miss Bingley inquired about Darcy's sister, and the conversation shifted to the accomplishments of young women, with Darcy setting high standards. The evening wore on, and Elizabeth, distracted by the conversation, decided to leave. Miss Bingley took the opportunity to criticize Elizabeth, accusing her of undermining other women to appeal to men. Darcy agreed that any cunning art was despicable, though Miss Bingley wasn't satisfied with his response. Elizabeth returned to announce Jane's worsening condition, prompting Bingley to suggest sending for Mr. Jones, despite his sister's scepticism. It was agreed to send for him if Jane showed no improvement by morning. The sisters, despite their proclaimed misery, found solace in duets, while Bingley ensured his housekeeper took extra care of Jane and Elizabeth. Elizabeth stayed by Jane's side, warmed by Bingley's genuine concern and attentions, a stark contrast to his sister's shallow displays. Chapter 9. Morning Surprises. Elizabeth spent most of the night in her sister's room, keeping a watchful eye. By morning, she was able to send a decent report to Mr. Bingley through a housemaid, followed by a more formal one to the elegant ladies waiting on his sisters. Despite Jane's slight improvement, Elizabeth still requested a note be sent to Longbourn, asking her mother to visit and judge Jane's condition herself. The note was dispatched quickly, and Mrs. Bennet, along with her 2 youngest daughters, arrived at Netherfield soon after breakfast. Had Jane been in any real danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been beside herself with worry. But seeing that her illness wasn't severe, she was in no rush for her daughter to recover, as that would mean leaving Netherfield. She brushed off Jane's suggestion of going home, and, with the apothecary's agreement, insisted on staying put. After a short visit with Jane, Mrs. Bennet and her daughters joined Miss Bingley in the breakfast parlour. Mr. Bingley met them with a hopeful smile. "I trust Miss Bennet isn't worse than expected, Mrs. Bennet." "Oh, she's far too ill to be moved," Mrs. Bennet declared dramatically. "Mr. Jones says we mustn't even think of it. We'll need to impose on your kindness a bit longer." "Moved?" Bingley exclaimed. "Absolutely not. My sister wouldn't hear of it." Miss Bingley, with a frosty civility, added, "You can be sure, madam, that Miss Bennet will receive every possible care while she's with us." Mrs. Bennet was effusive in her thanks. "I don't know what we'd do without such good friends. Jane is very ill and suffers greatly, though she bears it with such patience. She has the sweetest temper I've ever seen. My other girls could learn a lot from her. And Mr. Bingley, what a lovely room you have, with such a charming view. I hope you're not planning to leave Netherfield any time soon, even with your short lease." "Whatever I do quickly," he replied with a smile. "But for now, I'm quite settled here." Elizabeth, unable to resist, teased, "That sounds about right for you." "You're starting to understand me, are you?" he asked, turning to her with a twinkle in his eye. "Oh yes, I understand you perfectly." "I wish I could take that as a compliment," he said, laughing. "But being so easy to read is rather pitiful." "It's neither here nor there. Sometimes a straightforward character is just as admirable as a complex one." "Lizzie," Mrs. Bennet interrupted, "remember where you are. Don't go running on like you do at home." Bingley, amused, continued, "I didn't know you studied character, Miss Bennet. It must be quite entertaining." "Yes, but the more complex ones are, the most fun." "The country doesn't offer much variety for such studies," Darcy commented. "It's a very limited society." "But people change so much that there's always something new to observe." "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Bennet chimed in, affronted. "There's just as much to see in the country as in town." Everyone was surprised by her outburst. Darcy, after a moment, turned away silently, while Mrs. Bennet, thinking she'd won, continued, "I don't see much advantage London has over the country, except for the shops and public places. The country is much more pleasant, isn't it, Mr. Bingley? When I'm in the country, I'm happy to stay. When I'm in town, it's the same. Both have their charms." "That's because you have the right disposition. But some people," she added, glancing at Darcy, "don't appreciate the country." Elizabeth, embarrassed, tried to explain. "You misunderstood Mr. Darcy. He meant there aren't as many people to meet in the country as in town, which is true." "Nobody said there were," Mrs. Bennet replied, "but we have a large neighbourhood here. We dine with 24 families." Bingley struggled to keep a straight face out of concern for Elizabeth, while his sister openly smiled at Darcy. To change the subject, Elizabeth asked about Charlotte Lucas. "Yes, she called yesterday with her father. Sir William is such a gentleman, Mr. Bingley, so fashionable and easy-going. He always has something to say. That's true good breeding, unlike those who think themselves important and never speak." "Did Charlotte stay for dinner?" "No, she went home. I suppose she was needed for the mince pies. I always have servants who can do their own work. My daughters are different, but everyone is different, and the Lucases are good girls. It's a shame they aren't more handsome. Not that Charlotte is so plain, but she is our friend." "She seems very pleasant," Bingley remarked. "Oh, she is, but you must admit she's plain. Even Lady Lucas says so and envies Jane's beauty. Not to boast, but Jane is quite lovely. Everyone says so. When she was 15, A gentleman in town was so taken with her that my sister-in-law thought he'd propose before we left. He didn't, but he wrote her some lovely verses. And that ended his affection, Elizabeth said impatiently. Many have been put off by poetry. I wonder who first discovered it could drive away love. I've always thought of poetry as love's food, Darcy mused. For a strong love, maybe, but a slight inclination can be starved by one good sonnet. Darcy smiled, and a silence followed, making Elizabeth worry her mother might say something else embarrassing. Mrs. Bennet broke the silence with more thanks to Bingley for his kindness to Jane, and an apology for troubling him with Lizzie as well. Bingley responded with genuine politeness, and made his sister do the same, though she was less gracious. Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, and soon called for her carriage. Lydia, the youngest, seized the moment. Whispering with her sister, she suddenly reminded Bingley of his promise to give a ball at Netherfield, saying it would be shameful if he didn't. Bingley's reply delighted Mrs. Bennet. "I'm happy to keep my promise. Once your sister is well, you can name the day. But you wouldn't want to dance while she's ill, would you?" Lydia agreed, saying it was best to wait for Jane's recovery. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters left, and Elizabeth returned to Jane, leaving their behaviour to the scrutiny of the two ladies and Mr. Darcy. Despite Miss Bingley's remarks about Elizabeth's fine eyes, Darcy couldn't be swayed to join in the censure. Chapter 10. Drawn-out dialogues. The day unfolded much like the one before. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley spent their morning hours with Jane, who, although slowly, was on the mend. By evening, Elizabeth joined them in the drawing-room. The loo table was nowhere in sight. Mr. Darcy was busy writing a letter, with Miss Bingley seated near him, watching intently and constantly, interrupting him with messages for his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were engrossed in a game of piquet, while Mrs. Hurst observed their play. Elizabeth picked up her needlework, finding amusement in the interaction between Darcy and Miss Bingley. Miss Bingley's incessant praise of Darcy's handwriting, the evenness of his lines, and the length of his letter was met with his indifferent responses, forming a curious dialogue that perfectly matched Elizabeth's opinion of them both. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter!" Miss Bingley exclaimed. Darcy remained silent. "You write so fast." "You're mistaken. I write rather slowly. You must write many letters each year, especially business ones. I would find them odious." "Then it's fortunate they fall to my lot and not yours." "Tell your sister I long to see her." "I've already told her once at your request." "I fear you don't like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I'm excellent at mending pens." "Thank you, but I always mend my own." "How do you manage to write so evenly?" He remained silent. "Tell your sister I'm thrilled with her improvement on the harp, and her beautiful design for a table is far superior to Miss Grantley's." "Would you allow me to defer your raptures until I write again? I don't have the room to do them justice now." "Oh, it doesn't matter. I shall see her in January. Do you always write such long, charming letters?" "They are generally long. Whether charming, I cannot say." "I believe that anyone who can write a long letter with ease must write well." "That won't do as a compliment for Darcy," Bingley interjected. "He doesn't write with ease. He spends too much time on four-syllable words. Don't you, Darcy?" "My style of writing is quite different from yours." "Charles writes carelessly, leaving out half his words and blotting the rest," Miss Bingley remarked. "My ideas flow so rapidly that I don't have time to express them properly," Bingley said, laughing. "Sometimes my letters make no sense at all." "Your humility, Mr. Bingley," said Elizabeth, "is disarming." "Nothing is more deceitful," said Darcy, "than the appearance of humility. It's often just carelessness or an indirect boast." "And what do you call my recent modesty?" "An indirect boast. You pride yourself on your defects because you think they stem from quick thinking and careless execution, which you find interesting. The ability to do something quickly is prized by the possessor, often without regard to the quality of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you decided to leave Netherfield, you'd be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it as a compliment to yourself. Yet, What's so commendable about hastiness that leaves necessary tasks undone and benefits no one? Nay, cried Bingley, it's too much to remember foolish morning statements at night. But honestly, I believe what I said about myself is true. I didn't pretend to be hasty just to impress the ladies. I believe you, but I doubt you'd leave so quickly. Your actions are often dependent on chance. If, as you were mounting your horse, a friend suggested you stay another week, you'd probably stay, and might even extend it to a month. You've only shown, Elizabeth said, that Mr. Bingley didn't do justice to his disposition. You've revealed more about him than he did himself. I appreciate your turning my friend's words into a compliment, Bingley said, smiling, but I'm afraid you're interpreting them differently than he intended. He'd think better of me if I followed through on my plans. Would Mr. Darcy consider your original rashness justified by your stubborn adherence to it? Elizabeth asked. I can't explain that. Darcy must speak for himself. You expect me to account for opinions you attribute to me, but which I've never acknowledged, Darcy said. Allowing the case as you present it, Miss Bennet, the friend requesting Bingley's return offered no arguments for its necessity. Yielding to a friend's persuasion without conviction is no compliment to either party's understanding, Elizabeth replied. You seem to disregard the influence of friendship and affection, Elizabeth continued. Often, one yields to a friend's request out of regard, without needing to be argued into it. In general, if a friend asks you to change a minor resolution, should you think ill of them for complying without argument? Before we proceed, Darcy suggested, we should clarify the importance of the request and the intimacy between the parties. Certainly, Bingley said. Let's hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, as that might weigh in the argument more than you realise. If Darcy weren't so tall compared to me, I wouldn't defer to him so much. On certain occasions, especially at his home on a Sunday evening with nothing to do, he's quite imposing. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth sensed he was slightly offended, so she checked her laughter. Miss Bingley, upset by her brother's nonsense, scolded him. I see your plan, Bingley, Darcy said. You dislike arguments and want to end this one. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet postpone yours until I'm gone, I'd be thankful. What you ask is no sacrifice for me, Elizabeth said. Mr. Darcy should finish his letter. Darcy took her advice and completed his letter. Afterwards, he requested some music from Miss Bingley and Elizabeth. Miss Bingley quickly moved to the piano, asking Elizabeth to lead, which she politely declined. Miss Bingley began to play, joined by her sister in singing. Elizabeth, turning over some music books, couldn't help but notice how often Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She was puzzled why he would look at her if he disliked her so much. She concluded that he must find something particularly wrong about her. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley switched to a lively Scotch tune. Darcy, approaching Elizabeth, asked if she felt inclined to dance a reel. She smiled but didn't answer. He repeated the question, surprised by her silence. I heard you, she said. I couldn't decide what to say. You wanted me to say yes, so you could despise my taste. I like to overturn such schemes and cheat people of their premeditated contempt. I've decided to tell you I don't want to dance a reel at all. Now despise me if you dare. Indeed, I do not dare. Elizabeth, expecting to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. There was a sweetness and archness in her manner that made it hard for anyone to be offended. Darcy had never been so captivated by any woman. If not for her connections, he believed he might be in danger of falling for her. Miss Bingley noticed his interest and became jealous, hoping Jane's recovery would soon send Elizabeth away. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking Elizabeth by talking about their supposed marriage and planning his happiness with such an alliance. I hope, she said while walking with Darcy the next day, you'll give your mother-in-law a few hints on holding her tongue when this event happens. And if you can, stop the younger girls from chasing officers. Also try to curb your wife's conceit and impertinence. Anything else for my domestic bliss? Oh yes, place your uncle and Aunt Phillips's portraits in Pemberley's gallery, next to your great-uncle the judge. They're in the same profession, just different lines. And don't have your wife's portrait painted. No artist could capture those beautiful eyes. True, it would be hard to capture their expression, but their colour, shape, and fine eyelashes could be copied. At that moment, Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth joined them. Miss Bingley, embarrassed, said, "I didn't know you were walking." "You treated us terribly," Mrs. Hurst replied, "running off without telling us." She took Darcy's arm, leaving Elizabeth to walk alone. The path was narrow, just wide enough for three. Darcy, feeling their rudeness, said, "This path is too narrow. We should move to the avenue." Elizabeth, not wanting to stay, laughed and said, "No, stay where you are. You look charming together. The scene would be ruined by a fourth. Goodbye." She ran off, delighted at the thought of returning home soon. Jane was already well enough to leave her room for a few hours that evening.